Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us for another episode.
Hi everyone, and thank you for being here. This is the 10th and the final of our Grand Challenge sessions, titled Transforming the Narrative Landscape, Advocacy, Activism and Art. We like to begin all of our Grand Challenges by remembering the many millions of people that we have gathered here on behalf of, several of who are not permitted to travel here to be with us. So may I please ask you to set aside your phones and connect your hearts and minds, not just with the complex issues of statelessness, but the people of statelessness. We read you the words of Darien Tador. Resist, my people. Resist them. In Jerusalem, I dressed my wounds and breathed my sorrows and carried the soul in my palm for an Arab Palestine. I will not succumb to the peaceful solution. Never lower my flags until I evict them from my land. I cast them aside for a coming time. Resist, my people, resist them. Resist the settlers' robbery and follow the caravan of martyrs. Shred the disgraceful constitution which imposed degradation and humiliation and deterred us from restoring justice. They burned blameless children. As for Hadil, they sniped her in public, killed her in broad daylight. Resist, my people, resist them. Resist the colonialist onslaught. Pay no mind to his agents among us who chain us with a peaceful illusion. Do not fear doubtful tongues. The truth in your heart is stronger. As long as you resist in a land that has lived through raids and victory, so Ali came from his grave. Resist, my rebellious people. Write me as prose on the agarwood. My remains have you as a response. Resist, my people. Resist them. Resist, my people. Resist them.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Thank you for reading that. Hello, welcome to this session. As Ashley's already said, this is the final Grand Challenge. So welcome to you. I hope you're all feeling still energized and now looking forward to a transformed world after this conference. My name is Stephen Stenning. So I'm here at the conference, taking part in the conference as part of Empathy and Risk. So as part of the artwork you've seen around you and hopefully you've interacted with. I'm also here in a dual role. I'm also here because I'm with the British Council, where I'm head of their arts and society work, and that is about arts and cultural responses to global challenges, and with an obvious relevancy, therefore, to this conference. However, the job at the moment for me is to really just introduce the people who know a great deal more about what we're going to speak about than I do. And we have a fabulous panel that I will introduce you to in just a moment. Just a word of warning, you will see me at times playing with my mobile phone. That is not because I'm distracted or on any app, or well, I am kind of on an app, but it's actually just because I'm trying to modernize. I'm working with a lot of young people who use their mobile device as a way of taking notes, and I'm trying to learn how to do that. So my notes are on this. That's all that's happening. Anyway, what I'm looking to do with this session, as Aisling already said, it's transforming the narrative landscape, particularly important as we get to the end of this conference. What I'm looking to do is introduce our speakers, then try and move into, with a few questions, into a debate that we can kind of engage in as one group as far as possible. That's the aim, anyway. Hopefully that will be joyous and painless. Okay, so to the major part, which is introducing our wonderful panelists. So you will hear from them all, and firstly we have Valerie P.A., who is from the International Observatory of Human Rights, and each of the panelists will tell you more about themselves. And next to Valerie, we have Hareh Sarkisian, who has also been contributing to the arts program. You may have seen his glorious video up in the club room, but again, he'll tell you more about his work. We also have Kirsty Belton, who's here from ISI, but for many more reasons, which will become very apparent when she speaks as soon as I've finished. And then Barbara Quitter, sorry, I checked the pronunciation of your surname and then got it wrong. Sorry about that. And she's from Americans for a Democratic Bahrain. Is that correct? Close enough. Okay, and our next panelist, Davina Wadley, is from the Statelessness Network for Asia. And last but by no means least, we have Sujad, I'm going to try and get your name absolutely spot on, Sujadin Karimuddin, who is co-founder of Elam Empowerment. But there is a connection, and you will hear more of that later. Okay, so without further ado, I will ask Kirsty if you would like to just come up and give us your presentation.
If I speak like this, okay, there we go. So good afternoon, everybody. Is this a good volume? Perfect, thank you. So in terms of transforming the narrative landscape, I think we have to begin with ourselves and our own work. So part of what I am doing, I think, on this panel is expressing my work through a different narrative than I've ever used before. I'm a social scientist. I got my PhD in 2014 in political science, and I've done all the things that you're supposed to do as a good social scientist, the publications, etc. And it didn't speak to my heart. It isn't what I felt I wanted to do. And so this is going to be my first time expressing my work through creative writing. So 2 different pieces. One is a brief spoken word piece, and a second piece is going to be a portion of a chapter from a novel I'm writing that addresses statelessness. So the first piece is entitled Humanize. And I don't know how to use the mic so well, so I'm gonna get loud, potentially. So here we go. Humanize. Question. If I listen, can I then speak you? Does your existence depend upon my words, my recognition of you as stateless? Reply. We breathe, we bleed, we vibrate under the same sky as you. Our cries, our whispers, our shouts, our demands, our love utterances, our curses, our prayers. We pulsate within and among these as you do. Yet, in your need to recognize, hypothesize, categorize, theorize, legalize, you forget to humanize. We are not stateless. We are not merely a word. Within the act of listening lives the right to be heard. Thank you. And then this second piece is Untitled. Again, it's a work of fiction. I'm supposed to have some disclaimer here, I'm sure. It's not supposed to represent anybody we know in actuality, etc. Okay. It would help if I started the story in the right place. Rashid, I need you to come home now, his father whispered into his ear as he bent down, pretending to help him gather a net. Rashid could sense the urgency in his father's voice, and he hurriedly thrust the remaining net into his bucket. From the corner of his eye, Rashid noticed his father's eyelid jumping. It always jumped when he was nervous. Let's talk as if we're having a good day, his father mumbled quickly as he hailed a neighbor who was walking by. Rashid swallowed hard, confused. He was usually told to be quiet, so now he did not know what to say. He could feel himself sinking into the muddy beach, and he noticed that he could not distinguish between the roar in his head and the crashing of the waves. "No fish today, then?" his father asked, fumbling at something in his pocket. Rashid shook his head in reply. "Father," Rashid began, but his father interrupted him with a laugh that was not his. "Tell me then, son," his father continued loudly, "what is it that you have done today?" And then, much more quietly, "Rashid, walk quickly." Rashid's unease lodged in his throat. He looked at the mountain, silently imploring it for guidance, for some clue as to why his father was acting so strangely. "I thought about drawing the mountain as I waited for the fish to come," Rashid finally offered. He could feel the mud slide between his toes and spread over the top of his feet. He fought the urge to dig himself out. His father laughed again, so loudly that even the mountain seemed to take notice, and the earth shifted slightly. "Art, Rashid. Maybe next time you can draw us some fish to eat." Another neighbor passed by and chuckled. Rashid's father placed his arm over his son's shoulders, but he gripped too tightly as he smiled. Rashid could feel him tremble. Suddenly, the heavens opened, and rain as hard as remnants of the mountain began pouring from the sky. Fishermen, their wives, children, animals, and vendors scattered in search of refuge. Rashid's father took the opportunity to shout, "Run! Run home, Rashid! Don't wait for me! Just get there!" And so Rashid ran. He ran as if his life depended on it, as if the waves were about to come crashing over him, as if the mountain were about to implode, as if whatever was torturing his father was about to envelop him. He collapsed at the threshold of their home, where his youngest brother opened the door and dragged him inside. Within a minute, his father was inside too. At first, Rashid thought it was the sound of rain against their tin roof that was shattering the silence. But then, when a bullet lodged in his father's stomach, he realized they were being fired upon. "Get down, Rashid! Rafiq, Ahmed, down! Stay down! Do not move!" their father ordered as he clutched his belly curling up on the ground. And just as quickly as the rain shower began, it stopped. From his place on the floor, Rashid could see blood pooling underneath his father's body. He wanted to scream for help, but even now, his tongue was thick and his voice was trapped in his throat. Rashid watched as his father pulled a series of worn bills from his pocket and pushed them toward him. "Rashid," he whispered, his breath more loud than his words. "Take this. When night falls, you, Rafiq and Ahmed, you go to the beach." A pause so long, Rashid wondered if his father were still alive. And then, "Sami will meet you. Give him this." Rashid was about to protest when more gunfire exploded and more screams punctured the air. His father pulled himself up, stopping only to rest his hand briefly on Rashid's shoulder. "Do as I say. Do not look for me." And wincing, "Stay quiet. Be dead until nightfall." He took one last look at his sons before staggering outside. More gunfire, more screams from a village under siege. Rashid placed the crushed money, wet from his tears, into his pants pocket. Then he slammed his hands over his ears so that he could no longer tell the difference between the pounding of his heart and the sound of people's feet as they tried to flee.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kirsty, and beautifully read as well. What a great way to start! What a great way to start the session, as well as being kind of stimulating and thought-provoking. It also, I think, the first piece, that powerful there seemed to me to be a powerful call to, which is important for what we're going to discuss about in looking to find narratives and perhaps make a case, and a case that's resonant and gets noticed, not dehumanizing, not forgetting the human stories, and in fact making sure we're honoring human stories. And a really powerful bit of your novel. I can't wait to see the rest. Okay, so if we can perhaps carry on the theme of art and Harare. Over to you.
Thank you. Oh, there's a mic here.
Too many mics.
Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harair Sarkisian, and I am from Damascus. And I have Armenian origins too. I'm third generation of Armenian diaspora, and my grandparents, they escaped the genocide in 1915, and they were settled in Aleppo. And so most of my work has relates to, or touches the issues that is related to the Armenian genocide, and also all the histories, narrations that I inherited from my families as well. So in this work I will show here, I usually work with photography. And here, this is a photographic project I did in 2013 in Istanbul, and it's called Unexposed. And it's about the Armenians who were forced to convert into Islam in 1915 during the genocide. And until today in Turkey, they call them the ones who fled the edge of the sword. Because by converting into Islam, they survived the genocide. So some majority of them were forced, and they all lost their Armenian identities and never spoke about their Armenian roots. Until in 2006-07, there was the Armenian Turkish journalist, his name is Hrant Dink, who brought into the attention of the Turkish public and the Turkish government documents saying that the fourth adopted daughter of Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Republic of Turkey, is actually Armenian. And her name was Sabha. And Sabha became later the first female pilot fighter in Turkey. And she was one of the pilots who also bombed Dersim, where there was a massacre of 25,000 people killed. So after Hrant Dink brought these documents, he was assassinated in front of his office in 2007, stabbed by a 17-year-old nationalist. But what happened after Hrant Dink's assassination, he brought into the attention of many of the Turkish society the issue that many of the families, they haven't heard any stories about from their grandparents, either the grandmother or the grandfather. So they never spoke about their village or their city or where they come originally from. So it was always secret. So what happened that these family members, it's mainly third, fourth generation, they started to become aware of this issue. And they started to dig more in documents and files that was, some of them kept, some of them were abroad in archival centers, belongs to the Armenian diaspora, and also some of them in the Armenian church in Istanbul. So they started to dig more, and they started to find out that actually they have Armenian roots. And what happens, and this created a movement, which is where these individuals, they became aware of their roots, and so they go to the Armenian church in Istanbul, and they get baptized to convert into Christianity, and they get an Armenian name. Because in Armenian, you have to have an Armenian name to be considered an Armenian to be considered as Armenian. So what happened is it took me 3 years to find 9 families in Istanbul to get their permission and to photograph them. And it was actually through someone who, an academic in New York. She was doing her studies about this group of people in recent Turkey. And she put me in touch with Becker, who was the head of this movement. And I contacted him, and he put me in touch with these families. So I visited these 9 families in their houses. It's not. I think if you put full frame, I think it might. Okay. It's okay. So what happened is I visited these families in their houses because for them, these houses is the only place where they can reveal their identity and they can talk about their stories as well and the reasons why they converted. So some of them they converted for as an act of revenge, just to show to the government, Turkish government, that this is why I am doing, because your denial and what the Ottoman Empire has done to us, and this is kind of revenge that I am reconverting into Christianity. And some of them, they do it as an act of love, because the partner is Armenian and he or she is not, so they convert. And one of the interesting stories is a rock star in Istanbul. And when he was really young, he used to go to the Armenian church in Istanbul every Sunday to listen to the Armenian Mass. Until the day the priest found out that he's not Armenian, and he kicked him out of the church. And this person went back to his house, and he was crying and very sad. And his dad actually comforted him, and he said, "Listen, actually we are from the Black Sea, and your grandparents are Armenian." And this was something hidden for him, and he never knew. And when he grew up, he decided to convert into become a Christian, Armenian. But the Armenian church in Istanbul refused to convert him because he's a very known figure in the music scene. So he went to Germany, and that's where he converted. So these people, the number is unknown, but statistics say there are more than 1.5 million, 2 million people who converted during the genocide, 1915. But of course, there's a denial about this. So what happens after they convert? These people usually come from small towns or villages from eastern Anatolia, where the Armenians were actually located. And so they come from these smaller cities or villages, and just to get lost in the bigger social fabric in Istanbul. Because if they stayed in their village, everybody will know that they converted into Islam, and it will not be accepted. So they just go to Istanbul and they create their own communities. It's mainly all secret. So they gather every Sunday, not in the Armenian church, other churches, because also this movement is also not very. It's not accepted by the Turkish Armenians who live in Turkey today, because this means that it will open the eyes of the Turkish government towards the Armenians and say their number is growing again. So I'm sorry, I don't. It's not very clear, because the images are very dark. It's supposed to be black. So I photographed them in their houses. We shared stories. I listened to their stories, and then so there was only one female among these 9 people I photographed, and this is her husband. Here, for instance, in this image, there are 11 siblings, and there's only one person who converted, and the other 10 refused to convert because they are afraid. So they stayed, they didn't change their religion. Yeah. So there is a similar story to this also with the with the Jewish people in Thessaloniki and who converted also into Islam because there was this rabbi in 16th century who saw the Messiah, and the Sultan in the Ottoman Sultan in Thessaloniki, he knew about him, so he asked him and he forced him to convert into Islam. So everybody in the Jewish society in Thessaloniki, they followed the rabbi and so they became Muslim. But until, of course, there are so many stories that they have secret. They kept Judaism as a secret religion, even though they practice Islam. But when the population exchange happened in 1923 between Turkey and Greece, all these people who were living in Thessaloniki went to Turkey. Until today, they call them the Donme, which means the converted. And until today, from their family names, they can distinguish that these people are converted, and there's always discrimination also towards them. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ara. And I have to say, I've seen those photos close up on an iPad, and they are fabulous. And so I imagine it's on your website. I'd recommend you go to the website because there's such intricate detail on them, and they're so evocative. Thank you very much for those stories, Hera. And I have to say, congratulations to ISI. I think they've curated this panel very well. There's a real mix of that sort of challenge of looking at arts and activism and academia and how it comes together. And perhaps one point of questioning will be how much they are to be seen as separate things in need of bringing together. But I guess maybe we're sort of moving a bit more towards activism. And I'd like to just ask Bridget if you'd come up and speak from the Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain. Yeah, I've given up on my trying to make notes on this, so I'm back to a book. And it works much better. I think this.
Okay, yes, thank you. Well, as Stephen said, my name is Bridget Quitter. I'm with Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain. I am currently their legal officer. So seeing that the title of this event is Transforming the Narrative Landscape, Advocacy, Activism, and Art, I see my role as falling primarily in that advocacy category. And if we're talking about narrative, part of that role is using the narratives of others and advocating for them, but not speaking over them and not speaking for them, but still advocating. So that is something that I'm conscious that we need to be aware of as advocates, how we do that and how we do that appropriately. So I'm going to speak a little bit about my work on Bahrain and statelessness there. So I'm going to give you a bit of context. Hopefully you all haven't heard all of this before, or there's at least something salient that can be drawn from this. So just the metrics. Bahrain has a population of approximately 1.64 million people, and as of the most recent census, the population was about 568,000 Bahrainis. So it's important to note when you're discussing statelessness in this context, already Bahraini nationals were less than half of the population. In recent trends, this is probably, when you take into account denationalization of Bahraini people, this erodes the native population further. So this also brings in the question of narrative and what does it mean for identity? What does this mean to be Bahraini when there are fewer and fewer Bahraini-born individuals in the country? And what does it mean when you can be born in Bahrain, have citizenship, and have it stripped of you so easily? So I mentioned denationalization, and that is a more recent trend. Starting in 2012, after the Arab Spring, from 2012 to the present, around 990 Bahrainis were stripped of their citizenship. Many were rendered stateless, though the exact numbers are unclear. Some of them were out of the country, having already fled. Some of them are still in the country. To what we know, the majority of them were Shia. And the loss of citizenship in Bahrain has occurred through two different avenues. It can be ministerial order or through the criminal proceedings. There are ways to appeal through both of those, but that's not the subject of this discussion, so I won't bore you all with that. So before 2015, the most popular method to repeal citizenship was through ministerial order. In 2012 and in 2015, there were large groups of individuals who were Bahraini activists and human rights defenders, most of them outside of the country already, that were stripped of their citizenship through this ministerial order method. Starting in 2015, the tactics changed, and it was more through the criminal convictions, and that's largely because of laws that changed during that time. So there were amendments to the counter-terror law and to the criminal law and to the citizenship law, allowing for revocation of citizenship as an automatic measure for terrorist crimes. Of course, the issue with that is terrorism being defined the way that it is in the Bahraini law, which I will discuss later as well. So this actually got worse in 2018, and so in 2018 and 2019, there was an increase in the use of mass trials to do so. So in those 2 years, there were 5 major trials in which 505 people were convicted and 325 were denationalized in just those 5 cases alone. The largest one first was the Zulfikar Brigades case, so-called Zulfikar Brigades. In May 2018, there were 115 that were convicted and denationalized. And then more recently, there was this case of what the government was calling Bahraini Hezbollah in April 2019, in which 139 were convicted and 138 were denationalized. And that's the largest number of people denationalized at once in Bahrain's history. So what does all of that mean for advocacy and activism and the narrative landscape? So from our perspective, as advocates, part of our role is raising awareness and changing the narrative and challenging the narrative that's being put forth by the authorities. So the Bahraini government's narrative that they have provided is that these people are criminals, they are terrorists. Our job is to review the information provided by these individuals and to challenge that narrative, to challenge that language being used as well. So we ask questions, we find out what may have occurred in this case. The authorities will say, they confessed to a crime. And then the individuals tell us, well, they confessed because they were tortured. And then that was used in the trial against them. So what does that mean? Using that language of confession, they've confessed, they said this is true. They've also been this mass trial element. There are fair trial issues, of course. Many of them were not allowed to attend court sessions, were not permitted to meet with their attorneys. So where is the narrative there of criminal justice? Or, the authorities will say, well, we gave them a fair trial, and then we hear the opposite from these individuals as well. And as I mentioned, the definition of terrorism, even using that language itself, we need to translate the narration there. Because Bahrain's definition of terrorism is incredibly broad and encompasses, oftentimes, if people are exercising their rights to free assembly and expression, they can be considered terrorists. And we also talk about the narrative surrounding what this means for families. In many cases, women are unable to pass citizenship to children on their own. It's only if the father is either unknown or is non-Bahraini and has another citizenship. So then it's creating stateless children. And part of the narrative that we need to be cognizant of there, and this is something that I know I've discussed in a couple of other sessions, is intersectionality and making sure that we're not only speaking about women as wives and mothers of stateless people, but as individual agents themselves. So that's another sort of challenging narratives that we're doing as advocates and should be doing. So I know part of this discussion is what's going better, what's going forward, and we have had some recent successes, which I'll also sort of challenge that narrative as well. So following the mass trial that I mentioned previously, in which 138 people were denationalized, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, publicly condemned this case and issued a press release and noted the arbitrary revocation of citizenship in mass trials, rendering people stateless, and sort of commenting on this practice being arbitrary in this unfair trial method. 2 days later, the King of Bahrain published a royal order reinstating the citizenship of 551 individuals whose citizenships had been revoked through the criminal proceedings. This is a welcome step. But what about the remaining 449 individuals? Again, these are very small numbers when you compare it to some of the other crises that we've discussed here, like Rohingya. But Bahrain itself is a very small population, as I mentioned in the beginning. So that 449 is actually much more significant than it sounds. Also, when we look into the metrics further, there's this narrative of this being a welcome step. People who had their citizenship restored, many of them are sentenced to incredibly lengthy prison sentences. Some of them to the death penalty, some of them to life in prison, some of them up to 75 years in prison. So we have to challenge the narrative of giving back citizenship to these individuals as being a great step forward, because we need to talk about what the actual impact is. If you are reinstating the citizenship of people who are going to spend the rest of their lives in prison, what is the impact behind that? What is the real effect on the ground of having that happen? And of course, we need to talk about the fact that this is still an extrajudicial act by a monarch, subverting the judiciary. Many of these cases are still under appeal. It's entirely possible, though very unlikely, that the courts would go against this royal order and apply the original sentence and deprivation of citizenship. Don't want to end on such a negative note, so I will sort of close with what is the bright side here looking forward. So as we said, this recent restoration of citizenship is a positive step, not in the same way as maybe the royal family would like me to believe. We believe that it's a positive step because this is a perfect example of advocacy efforts working and of public naming and shaming and public outcry working. When traditionally the narrative that we hear when we're speaking with governments, when we're speaking with the UN, is that typically they want to use quiet diplomacy and they think that tends to work best, where now we're saying maybe when this quiet diplomacy includes a call to action publicly from the High Commissioner or from civil society, maybe then we're going to see more real reform happen. This also highlights the importance of advocacy on the ground, the importance of activism, and particularly the work, the day-to-day work of monitoring and tracking of these abuses that is done on the ground by the activists and that we advocates use. If no one is monitoring this, if no one is keeping track of how many people were being denationalized and through which methods, if no one's tracking these numbers that I've mentioned, there are no facts that can be used to challenge the narrative. And then there's very little possibility for positive reform. With that, I will yield my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Bridget. Thank you. And thank you for that sort of focus on narratives and the need to challenge and translate narratives, and also challenge language and look at how language is used. I also really like that kind of note at the start about making sure you're not speaking over. So yes, thank you very much. And if we move then swiftly on to Davinia Wadley, who's coordinator of the Stateless Network for the Asia Pacific. I think there's a mic up there.
Good afternoon. So today, on behalf of the Statelessness Network Asia Pacific, also affectionately known as SNAP, I'm going to be providing an overview of 4 projects in which we are aiming to transform the narrative. So the first project looks at refocusing on root causes. Since discrimination on the basis of ethnicity, religion and gender is a root cause of statelessness in the Asia Pacific region, we are exploring how we can refocus our work to look directly at addressing such discrimination. In particular, we're looking at what has worked in other fields to overcome discrimination and thinking about how that may be applied to address statelessness at the grassroots level. Of current interest is the work of those practicing in the peace and conflict sector, who have extensive experience in building bridges between communities and resolving the types of disputes that can lead to entrenched discrimination. In response, we are in the process of mapping projects that have been undertaken across the region and globally to understand trends and lessons learned that could be applied by our members in the Asia-Pacific region. The second project that I'm hoping to share with you today is about meaningful representation by affected persons. Globally, we are seeing that an important trend towards increased participation of affected persons in spaces where there may not have previously been a platform. However, when we provide a platform for affected persons, it's important that we are conscious of making sure that any such engagement is meaningful. SNAP is interested in furthering this discussion to support meaningful engagement and participation, and as a result have been engaging with our members on this issue. One of the risks of inviting an affected person to present an event, but not following up with them on how to explore how we're going to implement the ideas they've shared, can lead to frustration and disempowerment. As a colleague recently shared with me, this only serves to entrench any feelings of insignificance and exclusion. Inviting an affected person to present an event can also be often an afterthought, meaning that the agenda for the broader conversation has been set. This will make it even more difficult for an affected person to engage in the discussions. And as we know, for many affected persons, activism becomes a full-time job, while holding down another job to pay the bills. The financial implications for activists and affected persons is something we need to take into account. If we're going to engage affected persons in our work, shouldn't we compensate them in the same way we would pay a consultant to give us expert advice? Another issue of note is that sharing stories on exclusion is traumatic, particularly in public settings. It would be interesting to discuss more about how we can look after each other better in this space. One idea could be providing professional support services to affected persons when we invite them to share stories in public forums. For example, witnesses in a criminal trial often have access to confidential counselling. This acknowledges the impact of sharing traumatic experiences in a public space. So one idea could be that when we're securing resources to support affected persons to present at meetings, we could include funding for those colleagues to access counselling services if they so choose. So then moving on to another area of work in which we are hoping to transform the narrative is by looking at the right to a nationality through a gender lens. The project with respect to Myanmar was the brainchild of UNHCR UN Women's Country Office to look at the right to a nationality in Myanmar through a gender lens. SNAP, in collaboration with the Norwegian Refugee Council, the Institute on Stateless Inclusion, and the Seagull, a local Myanmar NGO, with UNHCR and UN Women, worked together to implement this project. So based on both field and desk research, we developed a report titled The Gender Analysis on the Right to Nationality in Myanmar. It provides new insights into the barriers that are specifically faced by women in Myanmar in acquiring, confirming and retaining citizenship, as well as conferring citizenship to their children. Because this report looked at nationality in Myanmar through a gender lens, subsequently we've been able to broaden the reach of our work and build allies with actors that prior to connecting with us were not necessarily involved in working on nationality rights. For example, we've held workshops with non-traditional actors such as NGOs working on disability rights, housing, land and property rights, and the peace process in Myanmar, to share results of our research and explore interlinkages between these issues. Looking at citizenship through a gender lens has also provided an opportunity to discuss with civil society the deficiencies in Myanmar's citizenship framework as a whole, but also with respect to how it impacts ethnic and religious minorities. However, such discussions might not have been possible if we solely looked at citizenship through an ethnic or religious discrimination lens. And the fourth project I'm hoping to share with you is focused on finding entry points for engaging with the media on addressing statelessness. For this project, SNAP is collaborating with DLA Piper to develop an analysis which looks at media reporting trends on statelessness across 11 countries in Asia, and a complementary toolkit for engaging with the media on statelessness. By better understanding media reporting trends, we hope to identify opportunities for engaging with the media. We also, and by doing so, we hope to facilitate trainings with journalists and media organisations on the trends identified and the key concepts such as the main causes and consequences of statelessness, so that we can be all better on the same page. The end objective is to improve the accuracy of media reporting on statelessness and to bring relevant media actors on as allies in our efforts towards addressing statelessness in the Asia-Pacific region. So in concluding, if you'd like to learn more about your work, The report that I was just discussing, Gender Analysis on the Right to Nationality, is just down here with a number of other resources that we've produced. So thank you for the opportunity to be part of this discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Davinia. And I wish I had picked up that acronym SNAP earlier on. It would have saved a lot of pain. Thank you. And also, yeah, I thought that's an interesting note to bring in, looking at how we can look after each other in that on that kind of platform where we're telling stories, and being aware of the impact of sharing stories itself. So, if you'd like to take the floor, so I think you're going to follow on from there. There should be a microphone up there, Sujindin. So, yeah, over to you, Sujindin, to introduce.
Thank you very much. I'll just, you can call me Shuja, that's easier. I was just telling yesterday how when I first arrived in Australia, they couldn't pronounce my name, and then they say, all right, we're just going to call you Jay. And I thought that was not a very good idea. Jay doesn't sound very like me. Then I give them a solution. Maybe sugar, replace the ga with ja, Shuja. That sounds better. So let me start by a Rohingya proverb. It says, time at the Sorarfani, mancho song nogore. Time and streaming water do not wait for human being. In the last 40 years of displacement of Rohingya people, and it of course is a lot of people in government levels knew the Rohingyas, but it was not in the public knowledge until 2012, thanks to the smartphone and internet access in Burma. It became more in public, more information in the public about the Rohingya persecution. And as part of the transformative narrative we're talking about as the work we're doing, and we can, it's last 40 years, the Rohingya activists are trying to solve the nationality issues and the refugee issues. There are other problems that they have in discriminating problems. And it's getting worse and worse and worse. And today, I can tell you it was worse than yesterday, and yesterday was worse than the day before it was. And as we are talking about 40, when we're talking about time running, we're having more people coming to the world, more children's coming, and there are more and more people coming into this problem where there's no access to very basic practical thing, no access to education, no access to healthcare. And that is not only in Myanmar, it's also in everywhere they are. For example, the majority of Rohingya exodus or the refugees who are not in Myanmar are in surrounding nations of Myanmar. That's number one would be Bangladesh. I think plenty of already aware, and not many people talked about is China. There is a sizable number of Rohingyas in China, and Thailand. Not many people talked about, but in Malaysia, yes, India, Pakistan, and all of these countries are pretty much what they are. The condition is what they were in Myanmar, except there's one little difference here. Is that in Myanmar you are pretty much imprisoned in your own village, that you can't leave your village. But in other places, they may have some risk of arrest, but they can still travel, and it is at least known that in Myanmar, if you are arrested, you could be in prison between 17 to 45 years, and that's happened to many people. But in Malaysia, you get arrested by the Malaysian police or immigration, you'll probably be sent to lockup and then detention center, and then you'll be deported. For that, without taking too much time in this, we just started to say, all right, here what can we do for these people who are growing up now? They can't wait another 20 years or 40 years, another half a century almost to solve the problem and go back and wait to get all the rights. So this is where we started ELOM to support the refugees in Malaysia. I would bore you with this, all the have vision, mission statements, and but our approach is holistic development approach. So we don't only tackle one area, we couple multiple area which is interlinked with each other. Okay? Livelihood, for example, that we provide vocational training, microfinance, small scales microfinance things as well. Access to quality education, that include we are not only providing education in our center, but also training other schools. We are at the moment providing at least 20, support to 20 community-based schools, which, again, the refugees are not allowed to go to formal national provided schools in Malaysia. Therefore, there are a lot of community-based education centers that are operating in Kuala Lumpur. Women, I said yesterday as well, is a vital crisis within the crisis, I must say, the most negligent one. So we are focusing a lot in bringing up our women folks and have a voice in the community and also in the international community as well. Medical checkup, hygienes, all these things. Community engagement. Community engagement is not only the community engagement with the Rohingya community, but also wider the Malaysian community. And we have emergency aid, food and stuff that we do. I will just part that as well. It's across things. So every programs we have, we put in mind that how we can benefit in a wider. So we also consider like youth empowerment and cultural integration. Every programs we just incorporate all of those. Environmental awareness, for example. I'm carrying a bottle of water myself just to show that please don't drink plastic bottles. So just to point out, here this is our class look like most of the time. And that's the reason why. A lot of adults in Myanmar who studied in Myanmar have a very bad classroom experience. I call it classroom trauma. For example, when I was studying, I was the only one Rohingya in my whole class, 50 people, and I was the target of the 50 people, 50 students that was there, and including sometimes the teachers, not very kind ones. So for a lot of adult Rohingyas to sit in the classroom is bring back their memories of the classroom, so they get agitated or anxious in the class. So we create an environment that it doesn't look like very much classroom, but still learning is occurring for adults particularly, but sometimes the children also comes in that. These are our students that are learning with a lot of the Neka, so loves it. And we have these community gatherings with a mix of community, refugee community, and also the local hosting community. So to bring them together and to learn about each other and to bring that to call it social cohesions within the people that going to be sharing. And the food, of course, the Rohingyas love the foods, and it is. And this is our cultural cafe. This cultural cafe is a place where it's a meeting place, basically, for various different community groups. We invite students groups, for example, from different universities to come and have a meal with the Rohingya youth, for example, to exchange their stories and to learn about each other, to know each other better. Yes, that is the Malaysian students groups visiting in the center. And we try to make a lot of girls and women come so that other Rohingya community girls and women also be comfortable to come around and mix with them as well. In Kuala Lumpur. And that's another photos of iftar program that we try to take opportunity of any events, religious events or social events that can have. And the art, because of a lot of, I mean, it's needless to say here, the Rohingyas have enormous mental health issues that everybody knows. The refugees usually have. And we try to run programs for the children, for the adults, like arts programs, for example, gardenings that we have on the rooftop, storytelling sessions, music, and things like that. So we do. That's another arts programs that we encourage children to come and draw and things. And now we'd like to talk about this one. I was working with another social enterprise in Malaysia, and we were talking about employing some women. And they offered me to say, all right, we will take 4 of your community members, women, to work with us. What do you call it? I don't know in English word, but for pregnant women and new mothers to help them out with the daily things and a bit of a massage, it's nursing pretty much. So they needed some people who can read and write, because there will be instructions written and profile for each patient. They need to be able to read them and provide them the services that they are required. And to find 4 women, it was a big task. It probably took us about 6 months to find them. But we make sure that after the training, they would be in place in the job. They will get a job straight away, because they can't afford to come to training and then can't have the job either. And there's a lot of very limited resources we have, and we're making sure that if they have a training, a skill, and they're using it, and then they're making benefit out of it. So please, easiest way, alum empowerment. I didn't tell you what does alum mean actually. Alum means knowledge in Rohingya language. Please share with us. And from the alum team, thank you to everybody here.
Thank you, Suja, very much, and also for kind of bringing in the community perspective and the need, and looking at the need for a holistic approach. Thank you. At this stage, I received a note at the beginning about what the job was about here, and one of them was making sure the session sticks to time. I have an added incentive to ensure I do that, and that is both Herrera and myself have to jump in a taxi shortly afterwards. So I say that partly just before I introduce Valerie, because this is a good moment to be preparing for your questions, so you're all ready to go, and we get a lively discussion in the time we've got. So it's great to have Valerie. I think from the perspective of the International Observatory for Human Rights, that gives us a nice sort of way of bringing together all we've heard as an expert in looking at stories and presenting stories.
Well, no pressure then, 3 minutes and I'll be done. First of all, thank you so much for staying awake. It's the last session of the day, and this has been an amazing, amazing week. So congratulations to ISI. I'm standing on this stage and I feel part of the A-team, because I've got artists, I've got academics, I've got activists, and at the International Observatory of Human Rights, we are activists. We are very active. You will have seen my team running around all day, filming some of you, live streaming at the back there, social media-izing. In fact, I'm waving at Aisha right now because she's recording. But this is what we do. We create a platform. And this session is all about the intersection of language and people and ideas, and this is what this week has been all about. But what we do at International Observatory of Human Rights, or IOHR if you're lazy like me and make it short, is that it's about gathering up those narratives and making use of them. We need to be active. It's not enough to record. It's not enough for us to put on a live stream. This is about making a difference and taking action. So what we've done is we've created an NGO which is a little bit different. It's about creating these platforms. So we have what we like to think of as the world's first human rights TV channel. We go out in 12 languages on our social media. So we're in Arabic, we're in Farsi, we're in Turkish, we're in Russian, we're in French, German, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese. Ash here is head of our social media and all of our communications. And each week he's going, why aren't we adding this one? Or what about that? Or what have we covered? And the reason to tell you about this is not to sort of show off, look at us, we can speak lots of languages. It's about saying that the world's problems are in lots of languages, and we need to be speaking the language, whether it's through art, whether it's through academia, research, gathering data, or whether it's through the people in this room actually talking to each other and learning how we can all support each other. Because this is about collaboration. You don't change the numbers of statelessness that we've been hearing about overnight. We need to work together. So if I could run the little thing on our TV show, just to show you a little bit about what we do with IOHR TV.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us for another episode of our Human Rights TV. Tell me why you think your father is really in prison.
The imprisonment of journalists is a political punishment for independent and critical journalism in Turkey.
Now, the UN has announced that close to 800 journalists have been killed in the past decade.
The number of journalists killed, 65 in 2017, is very disturbing.
Now, since then, it's attracted more than 20 million followers on social media. Tell me what happened next.
I thought I can combine all my skills to celebrate the humanity that surrounds us.
Now, I was very lucky because Amal was one of our very first interviewees. But the reason that I wanted him to come and talk to us was I was absolutely fascinated by statelessness. I didn't know enough about it. I've only begun to scratch the surface in this week. But we have a grandiose title. We're the official media partners of the event. But what that means is not that we want to have our banners at the back and a big tick in the box. It's to say that the work that we do starts now. It's from now. The reason that we've been recording these stories, recording the narratives and recording your voices is that we want you to use this. We want you to use the stories that you have, bring them to us, bring them to Amal, bring them to each other, because it's not until you start amplifying your voice that you get a wider audience. So one of the things we put the live stream on, because I know there's a lot of people that can't be here. There's a lot of people that can't travel the world. One of the things I'm really keen for you to think about is how do you use platforms like ours to tell your stories, but actually to make action? Because rather than wasting the time of these amazing people who are spending time doing incredible research, which sometimes can take years, to go to very dangerous places, it's important that we capture that and we do something with it. And we, as I've listened to a lot of the sessions, I'm thinking, well, that's fascinating research. That sounds a bit like something I've heard over here. And it's really, how do we join those dots? So as media partner, I'm partners with all of you, and I want to use a platform for doing good. So I just want to show you something. It's not related to statelessness, but it's something that we're working on at the moment. In London, there will be the Global Press Freedom Conference in a week's time. We've just come back from Ethiopia, where we're supporting Ethiopia, which is World Press Freedom Day. But this is work in progress. It's not finished, and it's very short. So if I have time, let me just show you a very quick next video.
I never realized how much pressure we're under, how oppressive it's become until I leave.
I was in prison for about 7 years, accused of terrorism. We have a mission to the public, journalistic mission.
The imprisonment of journalists is a political punishment for independent and critical journalism in Turkey.
I was imprisoned, and they said, we think you might have something to do with the coup attempt.
I started to highlight what's going on in Raqqa. The media was not reporting about ISIS.
I was jailed 4 times. There were no independent voices on the ground.
It is very difficult for the electronic media and the print media to raise voice against the enforced disappearances.
Terror laws are being used against journalists all over the world.
This is a battle that we can win.
Stay committed to telling the truth, tell the stories of people in trouble and those in need.
They tried to intimidate us repeatedly. We say we never give up.
We see that press freedom is really in danger, and it has an impact on democratic models. The number of democracies has started to decrease.
It was so important, to be the voice of the voiceless, the voice of the people.
The only thing that I actually promised to myself is not to ever compromise on my freedom of expression.
Congratulations on choosing the most important but also dangerous profession in the world.
PremiumBeat.com.
Now, the reason I'm showing you this is we filmed this in New York, in Ethiopia, in Sweden, in London, in different places all over the world. We went to where these journalists are. We went to where they're locked up or have been locked up. And the reason they made this film is each one of these people has been good enough to give their time to give us a story that sits underneath this. Part of this film is now going to be used as part of the push to go and push for the UN to make a single representative to protect journalists. Now, I believe there should be a single representative for stateless people around the world. So part of the thing that my team will now be working on is to create little advocacy, tiny movies like this, as the basis for something else. We will start with this for statelessness, and we will push on with advocacy, whether it be through petitions, whether it be through putting on more events, supporting Amal and Laura, whatever it is, but it's about intersections. And so part of the discussions that we've been having for these couple of days is about how do you keep the energy up? We've had some amazing discussions, but how do we keep action into the activization on that? The last piece that I just want to show you is just a single page from our website, which really is an incredible lady. Can I just pop our website page up? This is a lady called Hannah Thomas, and some of you will probably know Hannah. She's an artist. What she's done is embed herself with Yazidi women, and she went to work with them because these women have been abused, they've been raped, they've seen their families killed in front of them. And she sat with them and she taught them art, and she taught them how to paint themselves. Then she taught them how to paint each other. And the reason that, I like to finish on this is, this for me, this is art and advocacy. This went to the UN, and the UN began to take attention. Now, I think, and you may know this, Hannah was going to be based in Myanmar with the Rohingya people and also trying to move around. I don't think she could get to Myanmar. She went to Cox's Bazar. And this, for me, this just shows when you bring art, when you bring people, and when you bring a platform together, what difference can be made. Hannah went with Amal Clooney. They've been working with the Yazidis. This is now going to the UN. Art can make a change. Platforms can make a change. But you can make a change.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you very much, and particularly for providing something of a call to action, I guess, about what we do from here and that need to both come together and to amplify. So I was congratulating ISI earlier for putting together such a great panel. It has been a brilliant panel and a lot of provocation. The slight downside of such brilliance is that we have about 10 minutes now to address the key question, or to further address the key question, I guess, about the need for transformative narrative. So my question was going to be about to what extent do we need to change the narrative? But I noticed there's already a question. So let's start with your question instead, because it's bound to be better than mine. I'll be the roving mic.
Thanks. First of all, thank you to everyone on the panel for those really interesting presentations. There's some really rich and exciting work going on to transform the narrative, which is great. So my question's for Davina from SNAP. I'm Khadija, I work at the European Network on Statelessness, so a sister network. And what we're currently trying to do is similar to what you were talking about in terms of meaningful representation of stateless people. So really exciting to hear that it's a similar thing that you're doing as well. And we're kind of at the stage now where we think about how we actually action meaningful representation and put it into practice. So first of all, it would be great to stay in touch and kind of share practices and where we're at with that as we're both doing it, but also would be really interested to hear from you, and also if anyone else from the panel has examples of how to concretely provide meaningful representation to stateless people.
Thank you. Can we just bank that one for a moment? And I'll try and gather a few. So there's that question on meaningful representation. I shall stop subverting the role of moderator and go back to the seat. And a second question.
Yes, I want to share with you the concern about the time. The stateless people, they live for long life stateless, and they are waiting for their problem to be to finish. For example, I went to Geneva in 2010, before 9 years ago, and I took all of the recommendation, which is I want from the United Nations against Kuwait to do good rules or recommendation for Kuwait. And we are in 2019, I am here in Holland, still coming to this conference, and nothing changed. It's become worse now. For the people in Kuwait, they begin to kill themselves. They suicide themselves because they give up. And those whose refugee come to the European country, in Sweden, 10 years they stay until they have the documents. In Denmark, very bad situation in all of Europe. They treat them badly, and they are waiting in the camps. So the time for the people until when they are going to wait. How can we make this time short? Because we went to the United Nations, until we reach to them, we take time. When they are going to reach to us, also it's need time. Those people, until when they are going to wait. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. A very kind of direct question there. And can we perhaps take one more and then come to those banked questions? Yeah.
Fareed Khan, Rohingya Human Rights Network in Canada. In one of the Rohingya sessions yesterday, one of the Rohingya activists actually made a very poignant statement. Time is not on our side. And just taking the Rohingya as an example, the Rohingya have been facing a genocide agenda for 4 decades. And the evidence was there over the years, and yet the people who should have acted, United Nations actors, other nations who believe in the rule of law and human rights, they basically did nothing. I came into this path quite by accident in some ways, because I started a petition when the atrocities came to light in 2017, after I'd been following the Rohingya for quite some time, and I decided to do something different. And it ended up getting 45,000 signatures within a few weeks, which then we took to Parliament, and I then helped co-found the Rohingya Human Rights Network. What I find, after almost coming on 2 years after the atrocities came to light, these politicians that we deal with, they sit, and there's sympathetic politicians. There's some really sincere politicians, and then there's those politicians who sit there and be polite. They listen to you, they nod their heads, and they claim to help you. One of the things that I found, and I don't know what the experience is with other activists, is to have a media strategy. We sort of came about our media strategy accidentally. We're a very small group. We self-fund, and we've managed to get some amazing media coverage. And I think that the use of media wherever possible, mainstream media, is something that is essential. And I think I would strongly recommend to all activists that there be some sort of media strategy. But if anyone can please comment on that in terms of their own experiences where they are, I would appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much. So if we can just go to those questions, and again, just, I don't want to sound time obsessive, but I'm aware there's so much to follow up from the wonderful contributions of everybody, and so I want to acknowledge now that some of that will need to happen afterwards. But I think we should perhaps start with you, Davinia, on that question on meaningful representation and addressing that one.
Thank you.
I think if all right. Okay. I suspect generally if you keep talking, the mic will come up.
Oh, sorry. I have to say I felt quite self-conscious speaking about meaningful representation when I'm not an affected person, but I chose to speak about it because when talking to colleagues that we work with from affected communities, there is often a power imbalance to not come and speak in these spaces about that imbalance. I guess in terms of how we make sure it's meaningful, it's an evolving thing, but I think communication is the best way that we can ensure that it's meaningful. So, and if somebody is coming and representing a community, treating them as if we would another colleague is, I think, an initial exciting start. But I'm excited to talk with our sister networks more about how we can make sure this is meaningful. But I might pass on to Shajauddin because he will have his own experience.
Thank you.
Actually, thank you very much for actually raising that in the platform like this, and thank you for the question. It is quite often, in a minority or persecuted minority or victims of genocide, usually people will want to hear from them, and then they are also very eager to voice their concern, and then we get invited by people and to sometimes different cities and places as well. Sometimes you get a flight ticket and accommodation, but not necessarily you get all the other requirements you get. And then most of the time, these people and activists actually, as Humanize mentioned, has a full-time job, and they have to take this. It's a battle. Sometimes it happens to me. I lost jobs going to the trainings like meeting like this, and spending a day coming back and not really having any follow-up with you. Just you're there. We told the story, and then khalas, finish there. This happens, and I think it's good that it's come to in the conversations now. People can hear more, be thoughtful about this a little bit. And the time, of course, take a minute. Time is never on our side, because that's why the alum is one of the organizations saying we can't wait for the politicians who politely listens or who are sometimes sympathetic, but no one able to do anything because it's sometimes it's not the party policy or not in the interest of the country. So we say, all right, let's do at least something we can change in the area. So that's everybody's job, I think. And yes, we are doing lobbies and changing in the bigger picture, but putting smaller puzzles in the picture is also very important as well. Thank you.
Okay, so and I think there's that need maybe to address the question, which I kind of really understand that there's people with a lot invested in seeing things change quickly. And we can be talking in a forum like this about the narrative landscape, but how does that respond to people whose timescales are very short? And then also the point about the need for the use of mainstream media. So would anyone else like to pick up on the timescales particularly? And I think, Valerie, in a minute we can come to you on the mainstream media as well. Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, when it comes to the question of timing, how do we shorten this amount of time that people are waiting? I would actually sort of direct you to the third question then, which is about media, the use of mainstream media. there's a platform there, and it needs to be used. For example, in the context of Bahrain, there is a massive community of Bahrainis online on Twitter, massive. Again, relatively speaking, it's a small population. But that is where we meet with the people. That is where we engage. Of course, one of the dangers of that is that there are many laws now that are coming out to restrict social media. So we have to be cautious of that, of course. But when you put that public pressure, when you put the information out there for the general public, that is when you can see change start to happen. So for example, with, like I said, in the context of Bahrain, when those nationalities were restored, that was not from the goodness of the king's heart that he decided to do that. You can clearly go from A to B equals C, where there was public outcry from the High Commissioner's office, a public statement on that, and then 2 days later, there was a complete reversal. That public statement, however, would not have happened had there not been activists and people engaging either on the ground or online or on media or through our organization, drawing awareness to this constantly. And especially because Bahrain is so small, there are not that many organizations working on this or engaging with the UN on this. So it is important that the voices that are there are really being used as resources and viewing themselves as resources to help and to open that conversation up with the UN, with politicians, where, yes, they might not always have what you believe to be the best interest of the people, because, of course, there are governments, there are political elements there. But if you don't engage with them at all, they don't know any of the story. They know half of the narrative, as what we're talking about is the narrative. They only know half of it. They haven't heard those challenges. So if you don't continue to present that information out there, then only half the story is being told, and they'll just believe that. So it's sort of, unfortunately, the timing won't get any shorter, but the more that you do this, the longer that you do this, once the will does manifest itself, they have that information.
And Valerie, do you want to pick up on that mass media?
Just very quickly, I think timing is and mass media come together for me. It's about being smart about your audience. So to give you an example, we've just launched a campaign which is going after the citizenship fees for children in the UK. They charge £1,012. I think that's appalling. We did some research. A lot of NGOs have looked at this area. The government in the UK makes £640 per child, which gives them over 24 million into the coffers each year. That's shocking. So for me, I want that to change. In the UK right now, there's a big discussion going on about who our next Prime Minister will be. It's a great time to make a lot of noise about something that will embarrass the government into doing something. And what could be more embarrassing than ripping off kids and refugee parents of £640? So I went to Parliament. I've put a petition through. We've started to interview different MPs. My audience is very small. My audience are a bunch of Conservative MPs sitting in the UK Parliament, desperate to get a job from whoever is going to be the next Prime Minister. So completely selfishly, mass media in that instance is no good to me. All my audience are those ladies and gentlemen that can actually put something through under the immigration bill changes. So you've got to be smart about the media that you're using. But just in case, I've also gone out and we've been in The Guardian, The Times, the House Journal and everything else. So that is giving people the ammunition to take that story, tell it very simply, don't confuse it, very simple, £1,012, £640 profit. Is this right or not, full stop? And then that's how you use mass media. Now, I'm absolutely gunning after this because I think it's shameful, but I'm gunning after it right now because I know that the immigration bill can be changed at this point. So again, I think personally, I want to see a UN single person sitting there for statelessness. I think it's fantastic that we're seeing bodies joining up and collaborating. That's wonderful. But actually, I want to see a guy that I can go and knock on his door or a lady and say, do this and make it work. So for me, when it comes to mass media, the next piece of work I want to do is trying to drive that forwards because we've got so many stories that we're hearing that need a place to land. But it's about timing and about audience.
Yes, sure. Go ahead, Christy.
So with this, the title, there we go. Trust, have faith. With the title of this session, Transforming the Narrative, I am somewhat uncomfortable with it because I'm not sure what the narrative is exactly, and I think there are multiple narratives. and they're all important. They all have value to add to our understanding of statelessness and mobilization. This idea of audience, though, is to me what is critical, and which is why I have started to engage in creative writing. If you're talking about in a space like this, it doesn't matter whether you're a practitioner, an affected person, somebody who's researched on it for a decade or whatever. We're speaking to the choir, so to speak. We're here because this matters to us. How do we make it matter to those who are not involved in this in any way, shape, or form, who have never heard of it, which is what's driven me to transform my own narrative presentation of it. So this idea of mass media, well, don't ignore the old, we have been storytellers throughout human history. Don't ignore that, right? So I think creative writing has a way to impact a far greater audience than we've given it credit for up until this point within this area of statelessness, this human rights issue, essentially.
Thank you. Yeah, that rounds nicely from starting with your creative writing piece. I think not forgetting the voices and the voices we have ourselves and how we can put those across. And Harer, did you want to add anything to that about the need to tell stories and the different ways of telling stories?
Yeah, I mean, this is also doing art. It's one of the ways of telling, showing, or communicating with the public and people who are not, who don't have access to all kinds of sorts of medias or even main media. I think this is, I mean, what I do also. I try to reach people as much as I can. Not the art scene specifically, but I'd rather prefer to reach normal public and to know more about the issues that I also work on.
Thank you. I guess I should do some kind of roundup, and it's pretty impossible. So these are slightly unconnected thoughts, but in just going through those questions and connecting the shortness of time and mass media, and then looking at the need to see media as the need to challenge narratives, as well as look at ways of creating messages for a mass media, the need to be smart with media, the need to look at audiences, and make sure you're clear who those audiences are and why you're engaging with them and what you need to say and what is the most appropriate story to put to them. And that sort of, we have a range of ways of talking to audiences. Some of the most powerful ones are perhaps some of the most direct ones, as I think we heard from Christie's piece at the beginning. And I think also with, as Harer was just saying just then, that the very kind of personal and direct ways of connecting with people shouldn't be overlooked. The variety of different ways there have been just through this conference of connecting. There's many ideas there that can be taken forward. I mean, obviously, the main thing to say is that, as Valerie was saying, you have a conference like this. The main thing is what do we do? What happens as a result of this conference that moves things forward, whether that is about transforming narratives or whether that's more about getting stories to audiences. What do we do? And I guess the answer to that lies with a group of people here and how much we can grab each other and connect in the few minutes we've got left here, the next session, and then how we communicate afterwards. And particularly in my case, that's going to be a challenge as I'm jumping in a taxi in about 5 minutes. But thank you all for attending the session. Thank you for such lively contributions and such well thought out ones. And I look forward to a changed world as a result of this conference. Goodbye.